On a damp morning in April of 1983, in Mercer County, Ohio, the gravel road leading to County Route 47 carried two things it wasn't used to sharing: mail and judgment. The mail came in a faded white 1972 Jeep DJ5, right-hand drive, the kind built for tight rural routes and stubborn weather. The judgment rode in the bed of a brand-new Ford F-250, polished, loud, and very sure of itself. Harold Kessler parked the Jeep just past the sagging fence line, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. He stepped out slow, boots fine in the mud like they'd done for 50 years, not 20. 69 years old. Same land since 1938. Same quiet rhythm. Across the road, three men leaned against that four like it was something worth leaning on. One of them laughed. Not loud at first, just enough to spread. "You deliver mail all day," the youngest one said, tapping ash from a cigarette. "And this is your farm?" Harold didn't answer right away. He looked past him instead, across 12 acres of land that didn't look like much to anyone who hadn't watched it long enough. Rows uneven, soil darker in some places than others. Nothing about it screamed profit. "That's right," Harold said finally. Another laugh, this one bigger. "Thought you'd at least own something worth the gas," the man added. Harold nodded once, slow, thoughtful. Then he walked past them without another word, heading toward the machine sitting behind his barn. Let me tell you about that machine. It wasn't impressive, not to anyone who measured worth in paint or chrome. A 1948 Farmall M, 40 horsepower on a good day, red faded down to something closer to rust and memory. Bought new in September of 1948 by Harold's father for $1,675 from a dealer in Salina, Ohio. It had plowed this land when the soil was still learning how to hold water. It had pulled wagons when horses were still faster over short distances. And it had never left. Harold reached it, ran his hand along the hood, feeling every dent like it was still warm from the day it got there. Behind him, the laughter hadn't stopped. "You're telling me that thing runs your whole place?" The youngest called out again. Harold turned, not defensive, not proud, just steady. "It runs what needs running." That made them laugh harder, because in 1983, farming had already started changing in ways men, like Harold, didn't talk about much. Bigger machines, bigger loans, bigger risks. You weren't supposed to still be using something built when Harry Truman was president. You were supposed to upgrade. You were supposed to grow. You were supposed to win. And Harold Kessler delivered mail 6 days a week. Route length, 87 miles. Pay, $19,200 a year. He used that income not to expand, not to modernize, but to keep something alive most people had already written off. Let me tell you about Mercer County in those years. Corn prices were unstable. Interest rates in 1981 had pushed past 20%. Farmers who had borrowed to grow found themselves strangled by payments that didn't care what the weather did. Equipment got bigger, yes, but so did the risk tied to every acre planted. Men who had been comfortable in 1975 were selling by 1985, but not Harold, because Harold never tried to outrun the land. He matched it. That afternoon, he started the Farmall M with a pull that took 2 tries. The engine caught like it always did, slow, then steady, then strong enough to matter. He drove it out into a field that most people would have called too small to bother with. Across the road, the Ford F-250 was still there, still watching, still laughing. And Harold went to work like nobody was watching at all. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Something old, something slow, something that didn't make sense on paper, but made perfect sense to you? Because that's what they were laughing at. Not the tractor, not the land. They were laughing at a way of thinking that didn't fit anymore. Or at least, that's what they believed. The sun dropped low over Mercer County that evening, casting long shadows across fields that looked the same, but weren't, because Harold's soil, the one they laughed at, held something the others were starting to lose. He just hadn't shown them yet. And as the Farmall M idled down, something in that quiet field shifted, subtle, unseen, but very real. Because what Harold Kessler was doing on 12 overlooked acres wasn't small. It was patient. And patience was about to outlast everything they thought made them right. The next morning, one of those men came back alone. And this time, he wasn't laughing. The man who came back was named Rick Dalton, 34 years old, fresh into ownership of 240 acres just north of Harold's Line. He had bought it in June of 1982 for $1,920 per acre, financed through a local bank at 17.5% interest. He was the kind of farmer people pointed to when they talked about the future. Clean equipment, clean numbers, clean confidence. But that morning in April of 1983, none of it looked as solid as it had the week before. Rick pulled up in the same Ford F-250, but this time he didn't lean on it. He stepped out and walked straight toward Harold, who was greasing the front axle of that old Farmall M like it was the only thing on his mind. "I didn't come to laugh today," Rick said. Harold nodded, not looking up yet. "Didn't figure you did." Rick hesitated, then glanced at the fields. "You're planting late." "Not late," Harold said. "Just different." That word sat there for a second. Different. Let me tell you about what different meant on Harold's farm. He didn't plant straight corn rows across every acre. Never had. Instead, he rotated small sections, corn, soybeans, clover, on a schedule that didn't match the county's trend but matched the soil's needs. He used less fertilizer, sometimes none at all. He let parts of the land rest, not because he couldn't afford to plant them, but because he knew what happened when you didn't. Rick had heard about that. Everyone had. Most of them thought it was stubbornness. Some called it outdated. A few called it foolish. "You're telling me you leave land unused on purpose?" Rick asked. Harold wiped his hands, stood up slow, and finally looked him in the eye. "I'm telling you the land remembers what you do to it." Rick let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh this time. "I've got payments, Harold. I can't just let acres sit." Harold nodded again. He understood that, better than Rick thought. "Let me tell you about Harold Kessler in 1969. That was the year he almost lost everything. A drought hit Mercer County harder than most years. Corn yields dropped below 60 bushels per acre. Prices didn't rise enough to cover it. Harold had taken a small loan the year before, $12,000, to repair a roof and replace worn tires on a Farmall M. Nothing extravagant, just necessary. But when the drought came, necessary became dangerous. He made it through, barely, and when he did, he made a decision that never left him. He would never owe more than the land could survive. That meant no expansion, no chasing bigger yields with bigger risks, and no machine that required a loan to prove its worth. Rick didn't know that part. Not yet. What happens when something breaks? Rick asked, glancing at the Farmall. "You don't have backup equipment." Harold smiled just a little. Not proud, just certain. This one doesn't break the way new ones do. Now that caught Rick's attention, because machines were his world. He owned a John Deere 4440, 130 horsepower, built in 1978, worth nearly $30,000 even used. It could outpull the Farmall M 10 times over. No question, but it also had more parts, more systems, more ways to fail. Let me tell you something most people don't understand about horsepower and torque. Horsepower is speed. It's how fast work gets done. Torque is force. It's what actually moves a load. Old tractors like the Farmall M were built with heavy cast iron blocks and long-stroke engines, designed to produce steady torque at low RPMs. They didn't need to go fast. They needed to pull, and they did it in a way that didn't strain the engine the same way high-speed modern tractors often did. That's why they lasted. Not because they were better, because they were built for a different kind of work. Rick crossed his arms. "I still think you're leaving money on the table." Harold looked out over his field again. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I'm not risking money I don't have." That one landed, harder than the others. Rick didn't answer right away, because for the first time since he bought his farm, the numbers in his head didn't feel like certainty. They felt like pressure. Have you ever known you were right when everyone in the room said you were wrong? Or worse, have you ever started to wonder if maybe they were right after all? Rick stood there a long moment. Then he said something quieter than anything he'd said before. "What if I can't make the payments this year?" Harold didn't react with surprise, just understanding. Then you won't be the first, he said. The wind moved through the field, carrying the smell of soil that had been worked differently for longer than Rick had been alive. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the land, in Rick. But he still wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet, because across the county, other farmers were still planting bigger, borrowing more, pushing harder. And Rick had already committed to that path. What he didn't know was how quickly that path was about to close. By August of 1984, Mercer County didn't sound the same anymore. Fields that should have been full of steady engine noise had gone quiet in patches. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough that you noticed it if you'd been listening long enough. Rick Dalton noticed. He was standing beside his John Deere 4440, hood open, staring at a repair estimate folded in his hand. Hydraulic failure. Replacement cost, $6,800. Time lost. 10 days of parts came in on schedule. Interest on his loans didn't pause for any of it. He looked across his land, 240 acres that had once felt like proof he was doing things right. Now they felt like weight. Heavy, expensive, unforgiving. And then he looked past them, toward 12 acres that didn't look like much at all. Harold's, still green, still working, still steady. Rick drove over that evening. No Ford this time. Just a worn-out Chevy C10 he bought cheap years earlier and never bothered to sell. He parked by the same fence line where the laughter had started more than a year before. Harold was there, same as always, same posture, same pace, same Farmall M, pulling a small cultivator through rows that looked cleaner than anything Rick had managed that season. Rick didn't speak right away. He just watched. Finally, he said it. "I'm in trouble." Harold shut the tractor down. Silence settled in like it belonged there. "I figured," Harold said. Rick ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping in. "I did everything right. New equipment, good seed, full planting. I pushed yields like they said." Harold nodded. "They told you to." Rick laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, they did. Let me tell you about 1984 in the Midwest. Interest rates had come down from their peak, but the damage was already done. Land values started dropping. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land prices found themselves owing more than their farms were worth. Equipment loans stacked on top of land loans. Repairs stacked on top of everything else. It wasn't one bad decision. It was a system built on growth that didn't leave room for failure. And failure came anyway. "I might have to sell," Rick said quietly. Harold didn't respond right away. He walked over to the Farmall M, rested his hand on the hood. "You know what this cost me last year?" he asked. Rick shook his head. $243. Rick blinked. "That's it. Parts. Oil. Fuel. That's all." Rick looked back at his own fields. His own numbers. "I spent more than that last week just trying to fix one problem." Harold nodded. "I know." They stood there in the fading light. Two men separated by decades, but suddenly closer than either of them expected. Have you ever watched something you built start to slip away? Not because you were careless, but because the rules changed on you? Rick swallowed hard. "I don't want to lose it." Harold turned toward him, eyes steady. "Then stop trying to outrun it." Rick frowned. "I don't understand." "You're farming like you've got something to prove," Harold said. "The land doesn't care about that." That hit deeper than anything else, because it was true. Rick had been proving something from the moment he bought that farm, to the bank, to the county, to himself. And now it was costing him everything. "What would you do?" Rick asked. Harold didn't answer right away. Instead, he said something else. "Let me tell you about the year my father stopped planting 10 acres. Rick looked up. "Why?" "Because those 10 acres stopped giving back." Harold's voice stayed calm, but there was weight in it now. He said, "You don't punish the land for being tired." Rick let that settle. Slow, uncomfortable, real. "You're saying I should cut back?" "I'm saying you should listen," Harold replied. Rick looked out over the 12 acres again, then back at his 240. And for the first time since he bought them, he didn't see strength. He saw strain. But change wasn't easy. Not when pride was involved. Not when debt was involved. Not when people were watching. Rick took a breath. What if it's already too late? Harold didn't hesitate. It's only too late if you don't change anything. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving just enough light to see the outline of that old Farmall M. Still standing. Still ready. Still part of something that hadn't collapsed. Rick nodded once. Not in agreement. Not yet, but in recognition. Because something had shifted again. This time, enough to matter. And the next decision he made would determine whether his farm survived the next 5 years or disappear before the next planting season even began. By May of 1986, Mercer County had already lost more farms than anyone wanted to count out loud. Auction signs went up quietly at first, then more often, then regularly enough that people stopped asking what happened and just started assuming they already knew. Rick Dalton's farm was supposed to be one of them. His debts had peaked in late 1984, land, equipment repairs, operating loans, totaling just over $312,000. By early 1985, his yields had dropped again, not dramatically, but enough to make the margins impossible. The bank had given him notice in January. 6 months. That was all he had left. But something changed after that evening with Harold. Not overnight, not dramatically, but deliberately. Rick sold the John Deere 4440 in March of 1985. Took a loss, a painful one, but it cleared a portion of his debt and removed a constant source of maintenance costs he couldn't keep up with. He let 60 acres sit that year, something he would call unthinkable 12 months earlier. People talked. Of course they did. They said he was folding early. They said he'd lost his edge. Some even laughed, not as loudly as before, but enough. Rick didn't answer them, because for the first time since he bought that farm, he wasn't trying to win, he was trying to last. Let me tell you what changed on those acres. He reduced fertilizer use, not completely, but enough to let the soil breathe again. He rotated crops in smaller sections, following patterns Harold had shown him. Not copied, not blindly, but adapted. He fixed what he could himself. He delayed what he didn't need immediately. And most importantly, he stopped borrowing. The first year didn't look impressive. Yields were average. Some fields underperformed. But his costs dropped more than his production did. That was the difference. By harvest in 1985, Rick didn't make a profit, but he didn't lose the farm. And that was enough. Have you ever realized that survival is its own kind of success? That staying in the game, when everything says you shouldn't be, is sometimes the biggest win there is? Rick stood at the edge of his land that fall, watching a combine move slower than the big ones across the county, but steady, reliable, paid for. Across the road, Harold's Farmall M was still working, still pulling, still exactly what it had always been. Let me tell you about Harold Kessler in his final years. He never expanded those 12 acres. Never tried. He delivered mail until 1991, retiring at 77 with a route that had barely changed but had carried him through more economic storms than most farmers survived. He passed away quietly in February of 1994. No headlines, no debt, no land lost. The farm didn't get sold. It passed to his daughter, Ellen, who kept it just as he had, small, deliberate, and stubborn in all the right ways. And that Farmall M? Still there, still running. Same engine block, same steel, same sound. Rick visited it in 1996, stood beside it the same way he had years earlier. But this time, there was no confusion in his expression, just respect. I was wrong, he said, not to anyone in particular, but meaning it completely. By then, Rick's farm looked different, smaller in operation, more balanced, less impressive from the road, but far more stable underneath. He had paid down most of his debt by 1992. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. And he stayed when others didn't. He didn't become the biggest farmer in Mercer County. He became one of the few who lasted. And every now and then, when someone younger asked him why he farmed the way he did, why he didn't push harder, expand faster, chase bigger numbers, he'd point across the road to 12 acres, to a machine that refused to quit, to a man who never needed to raise his voice. And he'd say, because I learned the hard way what actually keeps a farm alive. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. If you've ever known someone who held on to something everyone else gave up on, something old, something simple, something that didn't make sense until it did, tell me their story in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to hear about the farmer in Clay County who kept a steam tractor buried in a shed for 15 years, only to bring it back when diesel failed him at the worst possible moment, that story is coming. You'll want to be here for it.